From General Motors to Government Motors to Goodbye Motors, I'm going to make a case why the proviso of too big to fail is one of the worst catchphrases ever coined when it comes to struggling companies that end up receiving government bailouts paid for by you, the ever-beleaguered taxpayer. It's very sad to see what's happening in Oshawa, Ontario. GM is getting out of town after making cars and trucks there for a century. I feel for the lost livelihood of people on the assembly line and the economic shockwave that will no doubt devastate this city of 160,000. Hopefully, Oshawa will not become the Canadian version of Flint, Michigan. Having said that, GM's pullout comes as no surprise. Some analysts were predicting the Oshawa assembly plant was doomed as far back as 2014. But in the bigger picture, the rot at GM actually set in decades ago, and it was something aided and abetted by government tinkering. Indeed, going back to the year I was born, GM had more than 50% market share in North America back in 1962. Imagine that. Every second car on the road in the swinging 60s was a GM-branded vehicle. Indeed, at one point, GM was so big that the U.S. federal government actually considered breaking up General Motors, similar to how Standard Oil was split into more than 30 companies in 1911. But how the mighty have fallen. By way of comparison, today the Big Three, or more accurately, the Detroit Three, have less than 50% market share combined. What happened to the American auto industry is nothing short of a tragedy, fueled by entitled union workers, cowardly management, a lack of vision by senior executives, systemic complacency, and finally, a taxpayer-funded safety net always lurking in the closet, all of which allowed this brutal culture to continue. I would argue that the beginning of the end for GM's dominance took place in the early 70s. A few seismic factors were occurring in the automotive world. First was the establishment of the Middle East oil cartel known as OPEC, meaning the days of cheap gasoline were over. Then along came the Environmental Protection Agency, which essentially killed off the American muscle car circa 1973. In the background, new players were coming into the market by way of cheap, fuel-efficient vehicles from such Japanese companies as Toyota, Honda, Mazda, and Datsun. Typical of the lack of vision by the domestic automakers, those imports were dismissed as junk made from recycled Coke cans. But those fuel-efficient vehicles were in fact the way of the future. And while the early Japanese entrants suffered from quality issues in the early days, the Japanese very soon upped their game. By the mid-'80s, if you were in the market for a small car, you would have been a fool to buy an American-made product such as the Chevy Cavalier or the Dodge Omni or the Ford Escort, rather than a Honda Civic or a Toyota Corolla. There was just no comparison. Indeed, the too big to fail GM just plodded along, making one mistake after another. Case in point, in the early 80s, GM correctly identified that the luxury car market was swinging in the direction of smaller performance-based luxury cars manufactured by the likes of BMW, Mercedes, and Audi. So what did the General do? Did it manufacture its own version of a BMW 3 Series? No. It took a bottom-feeding Chevy Cavalier, gave it a faux wood dashboard and some leather seats, marked it up by about $5,000, and called it the Cadillac Cimarron. So brutal was this overpriced piece of junk that it's downright astonishing that the Cadillac nameplate actually survived this act of brandalism. As well, by this juncture, GM had become a bloated company producing too many brands that were just variations of the same thing. A Chevrolet was an Oldsmobile, was a Buick, was a Cadillac. Only the trim levels and logos were different. The first domestic car company to receive a bailout was Chrysler in 1979. And that company's brush with death actually resulted in a turnaround under the adroit leadership of Lee Iacocca. A new category known as the minivan was hatched. The Magic Wagon was a roaring success for Chrysler, but It speaks volumes that today the gold standard for the minivan is the Honda Odyssey and the Toyota Sienna, not the Dodge Caravan. As for GM, to call its now discontinued minivans clunkers would be a compliment. And yes, I speak from experience. Lady Menzoid bought a Chevy Venture in 2001 and a Chevy Uplander in 2009. Both made for horrific ownership experiences in terms of quality control and fit and finish. Check out this photo. That's me standing with the grill of the Venture. We were driving along one day and it just popped out. How the hell does that even happen? Likewise, my first car was a '74 Chevy Camaro. That was also not such a good ownership experience. My next three vehicles were Hondas, a '78 Civic, an '85 CRX, and a '93 Prelude, all of which made for excellent ownership experiences. In any event, when GM received its government bailout in 2008, the wheels were put in motion for the company to do some much-needed course correction by slimming down its brand portfolio. So it was that GM-owned brands such as Hummer, Saturn, Saab, and Pontiac were all put out to pasture. Oldsmobile had already been jettisoned in 2004. But in retrospect, with the announcement of the Oshawa plant closing, as well as other plants in Michigan and Ohio, it was too little too late. GM is still to this day burdened with too many plants in North America, operating just one shift, producing too many vehicles that too few people want to buy. For example, the Oshawa plant makes the full-size sedan, the Chevrolet Impala. The current generation Impala is actually a superb car. But when was the last time you saw a late model Chevy Impala on the road? Indeed, fewer than 76,000 units were manufactured last year. And the Impala is now what's known as a fleet car, a relatively low profit margin vehicle that is primarily purchased by taxi cab companies and car rental operations. By way of contrast, GM is not making enough of the sort of vehicles consumers are craving, primarily small crossovers. But that's the rub, isn't it? When a company is supposedly too big to fail, and even when it does fail, it can count on a multi-billion-dollar government bailout, is there really truly an incentive to get it right? Which is to say, for the last half-century, GM has existed as a flying trapeze artist doing death-defying stunts with the full knowledge that a safety net was always in place. Time to take that safety net away. Time to let nature take its course. For the Rebel.media, I'm David the Menzoid Menzies. Hey folks, the Rebel has a new app. Please download that app and take the Rebel with you wherever you go.